Law 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Law 2. A robot must obey orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Law 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is a No Fear Cast, podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 2, episode lucky number 13, and we are starting a new episode series on robots and androids. So before we get into our discussion about robots, and today we're going to focus primarily on just why robots and androids scare us, do a little bit of the background on robots in writing and culture from, say, the 19th century up until the 1930s or 40s or so. I just want to make a note that the introduction that Matt read for us there were the famous 3 laws of robotics that Isaac Asimov came up with for his robot stories. I believe the 3 laws of robotics actually came from the 1942 short story Runaround, but he had a whole series of stories collected in I, Robot, and then there was also some robot detective stories, which I very much enjoy. But we're going to hold off on talking about Asimov, Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, and some of the later robot writers to focus more on, like I said earlier, the kind of origin of robots and how we as humans think about them, their capacities, and how they may creep us out a little bit. So first, I'm going to pass it off to Lisa to give us a little bit of a description of where the word robot came from. And then I think Matt has some things he wants to talk about with the Uncanny Valley.
Yeah, it's interesting because the idea of robots are always or usually linked to science fiction, particularly like futuristic science fiction. So they've always seemed to be a very modern idea, something that we're always promised at some point in the future. But when we started getting ready for this episode, I noticed that the idea of robots really existed for a lot longer than I even realized. And of course, they're different than what we are probably imagining right now when I say robot. They weren't exactly like an artificial intelligence or anything like that we would think of in science fiction today. But the term robot actually comes from a 1920 science fiction play by a Czech writer by the name of Karel Čapek. And I probably just butchered the name, but I don't speak Czech, so you're going to have to give me a pass on that one. But it comes from his play, which is known as RUR for Rosumovi Universani Roboti, which is Rossum's Universal Robots. And he really coined that term robot, which comes from, I believe, and I may be wrong on all of this, but it comes from a Czech word that is close to what we would understand as like enforced labor or slavery. So the idea of something that is created for us to work. And so you can kind of see where it would get the idea of robots here. Now, when he was writing about robots, it wasn't exactly, like I said, like we are thinking of a mechanical humanoid creature. It was actually something that might be closer in our science fiction today, the idea of like clones. They were flesh and blood people, but they weren't born naturally, if that makes sense. So the kind of a human race that was created just for a workforce. And what I find really interesting is this is the first use of the word robot, as far as I could find. This is the first use of the word robot, and the play actually ends in a robot rebellion, which is something that I think has become a trope with this theme or motif. Is anytime you have robots, especially if they're used for our own workforce, then there's going to be some sort of uprising, which kind of leads us into the idea of why we find robots scary.
Well, Lisa, one of the reasons that people seem to find robots and androids scary, and Mel mentioned this kind of right after our intro, is what has come to be known as the Uncanny Valley. And this was originally kind of created, or I guess identified by a professor of robotics, a Japanese professor named Masahiro Mori, who was the first to kind of use the term. And that was in 1970, and it was translated in a book in English as Uncanny Valley in 1978. And for those of you who don't know what the Uncanny Valley is, it's basically the idea that the closer that robots or androids begin to look and act like humans, the weirder they are to us, unless they are exactly human. And it gets the name because if you were to kind of have a graph, like an XY axis, and on the bottom, the X, you would probably have, how close it is to a human, and on the Y axis going up, it would be how much humans like it or their emotional response to it. It starts going up, but once it gets really close to being human-like, there's this weird dip down before it goes back up to perfect replica of human. And that's what they started calling this Uncanny Valley, because that huge dip is this valley. And what it all means is that, if you've ever looked at, one of those Victorian-era porcelain dolls with those creepy faces and unblinking eyes, or if you've seen some of the androids or very realistic-like robots that are being used in Japan as greeters in stores and that sort of things, the things that look really close to human, but they're not, and you look at it and go, oh my God, that's creepy. That's the Uncanny Valley. And what's interesting, I think, for me about it is that, it's something we're experiencing more and more and more. I was just, I don't remember where, it was somewhere online, and I saw a picture of a side-by-side comparison of the Lara Croft model from the original Tomb Raider and the Lara Croft model from the most recent Tomb Raider. And one is just, a bunch of polygons, basically. And at the time, of course, it was groundbreaking. But the one on the right from the most recent one looks practically human, but not quite. And that's that's the part that's really weird. And it's just, it's unnerving. And there have been a lot of people who have kind of talked about what it is and theorizing that it's some sort of, reptilian brain sort of psychological response and that sort of thing. Because when you look at these things that are very close to human but not, it's almost like, I don't want to get too morbid, but if you've ever been to a funeral for someone that you knew well and they had an open casket, it's a very similar situation. I remember the first funeral that I went to, and looking at the person was like, this is not the person that I knew. It looks a lot like them, but it doesn't look like them. It's not them. And there have been a lot of philosophers who have sort of speculated that might be where this is coming from, because it's very close to human, but not quite. And, even though it moves unlike a corpse, there's just something off-putting about it in this, evolutionary thing that goes back, who knows how long. But, we're seeing it more and more. And I think that's why I find it so fascinating is with CGI being used more and more, you've got, take for instance, the Star Wars movie Rogue One, where they resurrected the dead actor Peter Cushing, and literally, by using CG to put him back in there. And it's very well done computer-generated effects, but I was a little unnerved in the theater watching it just because I know the guy's dead, and he's been dead for a while. And it's weird and it's bizarre to see. And, it's kind of it brings that question of, well, what's next too? I think that's where some of the horror comes from as well, is this idea of, if we can bring Peter Cushing back digitally and it looks really close to the way he did, how far are we from having videos where they're completely computer generated and absolute fakes, where it's not the actual people at all in them? I don't know. Mel, what do you think?
Oh, I think we're really close to that. It's funny, last week I had the news on in the background. I was working and they were talking about how people are already starting to play around with taking people's images and making them do things or say things they never said. And it gives a whole new meaning to, fake videos, because it would be very difficult to say that one didn't do or say whatever it is if it looks that similar to you. When you were talking about the idea of a corpse, I think that's probably why reanimated corpses are so scary to us. The thing that should be dead but is alive. Was it animated corpses? I think are at the bottom of the valley too, with robots. And there's this like familiar, or this thing that we're certain about, becoming terrifyingly uncertain and unfamiliar and almost dangerous. I don't know. Maybe it's like a self-preservation thing that our alerts kind of go off when we see something that seems human, but there's something off about it. I was also thinking about motion. You were talking about the Tomb Raider, like motion capture. I think when like Polar Express came out, or when the Zemeckis Christmas Carol was out, and we first saw, animated images acting like the actors themselves, that was pretty creepy too. And it's just getting better the further we move along.
Well, and I did just want to jump back for a second too to kind of piggyback off what you were just saying about the corpses. And one of the other theories about it is that it could be this innate sense of what they would call pathogen avoidance, because we've evolved to the way that the quote here is that the more human an organism looks, the stronger the aversion to its defects are, because defects indicate disease, and more human-looking organisms are more closely related to human beings genetically. So, I think the corpse thing might be onto something there, just because, you don't want to be messing around with corpses because they are huge vectors for disease, right? That's what decomposition is. So, and especially before modern embalming methods, corpses got pretty hazardous to be around pretty quickly.
Yeah. In addition to just violating all our ideas of boundaries between people and life and death, their corpses are pretty disgusting and full of disease. So I could see that. Humans are innately social, but we're also highly attuned to contagions or damage or injury. I could totally see that, like seeing a robot that looks like a person but has a hitch or something, as just kind of like switching something in our brain, thinking, is there something wrong with that person? Is there some sort of danger here? Almost like triggering that fight or flight, kind of part of our brain.
Definitely. And well, I didn't want to lose too what you were saying about motion capture, because that really does seem to be the direction of film these days. You look at, I just name a movie, especially in like the last few years, where there's been just this flux or influx of superhero movies and other fantastic things like that, where there's like motion capture everywhere. You've got the motion capture for the raccoon in Guardians of the Galaxy, or pretty much anything Andy Serkis does is going to have some element of motion capture to it, to the point where I don't really remember what the man looks like without being told, because to me he's Gollum or Snoke from the new Star Wars trilogy or whatever. And yeah, I think it's still to the point where it's still detectable as motion capture. They look very realistic, but when they get to that point where they are completely realistic and completely able to fool us, that's the part that has me worried.
When you guys were talking about the idea of the corpse, which is something that I had never thought about before, not in relation to the idea of robots, because when I start thinking about the uncanny and the uncanny valley, especially in relation to robots, my mind immediately went to dolls and why we're so afraid of them. But when you were talking about that, and especially the idea of a reanimated corpse, it was really interesting, because in my reading about that Czech play where we first got the word robot, a lot of the people were making comparisons between the Chapek's robots and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and that idea of, rather than a mechanical man, it's a human-made man. And so I can see now that connection is made. And one thing I find really interesting is if whether it's a doll or a reanimated corpse or a robot like we would think of today. I think one of the things that we're really frightened by is how far we can push it. If we can make something that looks so lifelike, or if we can make something that was once dead look like it's come back to life, when do we stop? And how do we know when to stop? It's that age-old question of science of just because we can, should we? And you hear that a lot with like the idea of cloning today. But it's very much the same fears, I think, that surround the ideas of cloning and that surround the ideas of robots, because we worry that if we make something, we don't fully understand the human mind or the human psyche or how we work. How are we going to understand, a human-like thing that we create? And how are we going to understand, if it looks like us and walks like us and talks like us to the point that we can't tell it apart from us, what else can it do? And I think that's the fear. So when we talk about robots and we laugh at robot uprisings, that's always what people are afraid of, right? It's not just that they might turn on us, but it's that we could create something kind of along the lines of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that we no longer have control over anymore.
Well, I think that's a definite fear. And especially when you see this modern technological age that we're in, where, just in my lifetime, I'm in my mid-30s, and I've gone from no computer in the house to a computer in the house to a computer with internet to a computer with internet in my pocket to a computer with internet in my pocket that I can talk to and make it do things for me, which is not perfect. It's still evolving, but that's just in my conscious years, that's not even the full time that I've been alive. And I think with robots and artificial intelligence, the evolution of technology happens so much quicker. And there's a term for it that I'm absolutely drawing a blank on, but about how quickly technology grows exponentially. I'm not even going to try to remember the name for it because I'll just flounder and butcher it. But basically that, our technology is going to continue improving at a pretty fast rate. Just look at the current iPhone or the current Android phones that are out there. 10 years ago, they were completely different in a lot of ways. Still very similar in a lot of other ways, but just the evolution that they've made in terms of size and capacity for things that they can do. And then apply that to something like robots or artificial intelligence, something that could learn and grow very quickly and spiral out of control very quickly. And I don't necessarily mean in a kill and enslave mankind a la the Terminator way, but definitely could evolve so rapidly that, well, like you said, we can no longer control it. And we don't know what it's capable of anymore either, because that is, I think, part of the big fear too, is that this evolution of robots or artificial intelligence would be capable of doing things that ordinary humans can't. That's what robots are for, right? They can lift things that we can't lift. They can go places we can't go. And now imagine them being self-aware and rapidly evolving.
And realizing how chaotic and irrational we are. We might seem like a danger to an aware robot.
Well, I think that's how those movies and stories that involve robot uprisings go, right? That robots ultimately are based on a logic system, because that's all computer programming of any sort is. You get down to the very basics and it's binary logic, on or off, 1 or 0. But even in today's programming languages, and by the way, if any of you listeners are actual computer scientists, please understand that my knowledge is only slightly better than the average layman. But all of these computer programming languages, we call them languages because they are like learning a new language, but they're all based on logic. And that is something that works very well for what we needed to do. Input this, output that. If this happens, then this happens, or this happens, all of that. But I think if a robot were to become self-aware and not develop any form of emotion or empathy I think you're right. They'd absolutely look at humanity and go, wow, this is chaotic. We should bring order to this chaotic system, whatever that may be. And yeah, I think that's where those robot uprisings come from. That or humanity is just a danger. Let's just eradicate them entirely.
Yeah, and that's why you need your robotic laws, which then you need more laws in order to make them work, and more laws and ways to figure out loopholes. And it just ends up spiraling.
I'm just... Sorry, I'm imagining a future a few hundred years from now where there's like robo-lawyers that are all finding the loopholes and fixing the loopholes. Your entire job is to find or exploit loopholes depending on which side you are.
We'll just give the robotic laws to the robot lawyers and they'll take care of it.
Right, but do we want all the robot lawyers to be androids or should they be humans or a mixture of both? I don't know.
Ooh, that's a good question.
Or at that point, will we be able to tell who is robot and who is human?
Ooh.
Well, arguably not, but... So yeah, that's kind of the Uncanny Valley and all that it leads into. But seriously, listeners, if you have not looked at some of these, and I keep bringing up Japan as the example because as a culture, they are very typically fascinated with technology and that sort of thing. But it's by far not the only place that has androids. But look at some of these recent androids or human-like robots, and I mean they really are. Some of them really are. You look at it and just go, it's creepy, it's weird, and I don't know. It's like a cross between a person and a doll, kind of like you were saying, Lisa. Like dolls, I think definitely fit into that Uncanny Valley too. So
dolls are terrifying,
and it depends on the doll for sure. Because some of them, you look at it and go, it's just a doll. It's not. But then the ones that are like close to looking human but aren't, no.
One thing that really has surprised me is how early on, I mentioned this at the top of the episode, but, our concept of robots really predates even the word robot. And one thing that struck me was how all of these issues that we were talking about kind of come up in these stories that involve these, I'll call them robot-like creatures. One I'm thinking of in particular is E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman, which came out in 1816. So, yeah, just over 100 years before we even had a word robot. This was a German language, horror story, really, for lack of a better word. And it involved what I think they describe as a wooden doll, which is a lot of times if you're reading a story that doesn't use the term robot, usually you hear either automaton or like a wooden doll, or even a puppet that can move on its own is kind of sometimes the way it's described. But really, for our purposes, is a robot. And The Sandman is a really interesting story, and it's about a young man, Nathaniel, who grew up hearing this story about the Sandman, which is really just like a children's tale that was popular in Germany, trying to explain kind of why we get, the sleep in our eyes when we wake up in the morning. And the idea was that when you're falling asleep, just as you're falling asleep, the Sandman comes and blows sand into your eyes. And that's what makes you fall asleep and like enter dreamland or whatever. And the Sandman wasn't necessarily a scary character, but in this story, he definitely is. He's almost like a boogeyman, and he scared Nathaniel. And that is sort of there to make you question, I think, right away, Nathaniel's sanity. Because later you hear about how, as a child, he snuck out of bed and saw his father with this strange man. And he saw something he shouldn't, and so the man wanted to take his eyes, and his father persuaded him not to. But then there's this rather horrifying sequence where the man says, okay, if I'm not going to take his eyes, then let's at least unscrew his hands and feet and see how he works. And which is what happens, and Nathaniel passes out. And this, again, all happened as when he was a child, and then he grows up and sees the man again. And this is when he has a fiance, I believe, but he finds her rather cold and lifeless. And he falls in love with this other girl that he sees from afar, Olympia, who, upon closer inspection, turns out to be a wooden doll, a rather eyeless wooden doll, actually. But the whole story, especially with the idea of the eyes and the unscrewing of the hands and feet, you start to wonder, and a lot of people have argued that Nathaniel himself is one of these wooden dolls and just doesn't know it. And you could almost even read his fiancée Clara as being a doll. I don't think she is, but she's described as doll-like later. And I don't know, the whole story is very unsettling because you're not sure really who is a doll and who isn't, except for Olympia. Olympia is named as a doll. But it sets up this idea of robots that we've been talking about. And that's the idea of being so close to human that you can't tell them apart. And I think that's where a lot of certainly the uncanniness comes from, but a lot of the terror of the story comes from the fact that humans and robots are almost indistinguishable at some point. And it's a very unsettling story when you read it.
Yeah, what you were talking about the story, Lisa, and the fact that we don't know who's a doll and who's not, I mean, just that in itself is kind of creepy. And it's really interesting. I mean, for something that was written, well, I hate to say this because stuff in the 1800s is just as modern in some way when you start reading it as what we're doing now, just a different technology. But this idea of possibly being narrated by a mechanical doll that's unaware of being a mechanical doll just heightens the terror, really. Because if you don't even know if you're a doll or not, that's pretty terrifying. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that we actually get the concept of the uncanny in some ways from Hoffman's story, The Sandman, because one of the first concepts of the uncanny in 1906 by Ernst Jentz, and I might be massacring his name, I'm not sure, I'm doing my best, it was basically the idea of intellectual uncertainty. You know, the idea of the fact that the mechanical dolls or the wooden dolls look so much like humans that it's hard to tell the difference, and the horror of seeing them when they are dismantled. And then later in 1919, when you have Freud's more commonly cited definition of the uncanny as a kind of unfamiliar or strange repetition, he focuses less on the robots, ironically, and more on the repetition of eyes falling out, being taken out, being carried by people, the Sandman being, dealing with eyes. I just thought that was so interesting that this idea of the uncanny, it comes from the idea of robots, even like you were saying, well before robots even technically, at least by the term, existed, that idea of like mannequins, you look at it and you're not sure if it's human or not. And that's what's terrifying or scary, the repetition of it, the uncertainty of it.
Well, that is one of the terrifying things, I think, of these robots, especially as they start to look more and more human, is that when you look at them for just a moment, you have that thought, wait, is that a person? Kind of like those baby dolls that are made to look like real human babies. If you just glance at them, you would probably very easily mistake them for a human baby. And it's only when you stare long enough to realize that they aren't moving or breathing or blinking. And that is kind of when the terror sets in of, oh my gosh, what is this thing? Even if it's just briefly, which, speaking of dolls, I'm going to use that to segue into another story that's very similar to The Sandman. And that's Daphne du Maurier's The Doll, which was one of her stories that was published actually in 2011. I think the collection was called The Lost Stories, but it was written around 1928. And I think this was one of those stories that du Maurier had written about in her autobiographies and had talked about quite often. So people knew it existed, but it was never published. I think it was actually found in like an editor's rejected pile. They had kept the story, but never published it. And so somebody found it later and published it in the collection. But the doll is very much like Olympia in The Sandman in that it's I I guess, life-size puppet is the best way I can describe it. It's a wooden doll made to look human that can move on its own. So it's an automatronic puppet, I guess would be the best term. But I think the terror in this story is slightly different than that of the Sandman, because in the Sandman, you get that very unreliable narrator well, there's kind of two. There's a narrator kind of telling the overarching story, and then you get Nathaniel's actual words through letters. But we're told right away, like, hey, don't trust me, I'm a little crazy, which was a popular way to tell stories in the back in the day, I guess. But with this, we get, with Desmaillet's The Doll, it's narrated by a woman's love interest, or a male suitor, I guess would be the best term for him. And so we get the story through a little different lens, and that twists the terror of it a little bit. Mel, have you read The Doll?
I have read The Doll. It is indelibly stamped in my mind. I definitely agree with you that the terror is more on the man side. And again, you have a found document, because remember, he's trying to make sense of this horrific thing he's experienced, and has written all these notes about it, and they're found in like a wallet or something on the beach. So it's unclear as whether he just ran away or ran off into the waves or what.
Right, because she even has parts of the story deliberately missing to make it, I guess, seem more authentic. Like parts are smudged here. We can't read what he wrote here, to kind of lend it that authenticity. I had forgotten about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's gaps in the story. But basically, I mean, I guess I'll spoil away because it was written in 1928. So, when Daphne du Maurier was 20, which I found kind of interesting. But, if you're a fan of du Maurier, the woman character is named Rebecca, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And she is basically a point of obsession with this man who struck me as kind of unreliable because of his just completely, and I'm not, this is going to sound really negative or horrible or like I'm a robot or something, but his emotional, like, irrationality and obsession with this woman. Through most of the story, she's not even really paying attention to him, but he's just following her around, going to all these parties she's at because she's an awesome violin player. But nobody can quite figure her out. She's extremely independent. She's described as a very dark woman, possibly of quote unquote gypsy heritage. No one knows her family. She kind of comes out of nowhere, and she's an amazing prodigy violin player, and she doesn't need anybody. She plays her music only for herself and doesn't care if other people like it. And I guess it's just because she seems so unreachable. He just becomes obsessed with her. And gradually, as she starts to pull him into her life, and is kind of, as he sees it, leading him on, he realizes that her house is pretty strange. It's like almost completely unfurnished except for this one room. That's the doll's room. That is like very romantically, overly exotically furnished. And then the doll himself is quite exotic. We have Julio with his lascivious smile, or sneer, as the man describes it when he sees him, this slash of a mouth, and his tousled hair, who just kind of sits there with this weird, almost like uncanny idea that he could move, but he doesn't when the man sees him. And then later, as the story goes on, she says, like, I think 2 or 3 times to him about her music playing and her love life. Like, I don't need a man. I don't need a man to please myself or to find fulfillment in life, which he just finds is like she wants to be pursued. And then in the end, when she's supposed to be telling him if she can actually be in a relationship with him or not, he decides to go back sooner than she told him to and bursts in to find her needs being met by Julio. And she's enjoying this very much. And she says, basically, I don't need you, like, get out of here. I have Julio. And Julio is described as, his hair is tousled and he's moving at that point. And that's when the guy runs out on the beach, writes his final entry so we know what happened, and then leaves his wallet and runs off into the distance. And I think when I was reading this story, I was texting you, Lisa, and I was like, I totally see the uncanny and this is horrifying and everything, but I was kind of almost like rooting for Rebecca. Like, she never really led him on or anything. She was telling him that her life was perfectly fulfilled and fine without him the whole time. And at the end, it's like it's just his wounded pride and the fact that the person he was obsessed with didn't return his affection and doesn't need him. I mean, God forbid a woman be able to find some happiness in her life without a man. I just thought that was so interesting how that was like an inserted subtext in the story, which maybe between the sex and that was why it got in the editor's slush pile. But
yeah, it completely, well, and I think that's why I was saying the tone is completely different because it's only a horror story from the narrator's perspective. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I think I might have texted you this, but I when I read the story, I was like, oh, Julio is our first sex robot.
It's a great name too.
But I come to find out, of course, I had to look that up, and there was quite a precedent of life-size dolls being used for this long before this short story. Apparently it was popular with sailors, I guess, who would be out on boats for long periods of time, and they actually had a term for it, which now is escaping me. So I will amend that statement and say that I think, DeMaillet's The Doll may be our first sex robot story from a female's perspective, if you want to look at it that way. But yeah, I'm kind of like you. I was rooting for Rebecca, and as far as I'm concerned, she's a feminist hero for us all.
I mean, if she's happy, then
she's happy. She's able to live her life the way she wants. She doesn't have to answer to anyone. But kind of in the way that the Sandman is scary because you can't always tell the difference between the dolls and the humans. In this case, Julio is very much a doll. I think only briefly he's mistaken for a boy, I believe. But it's quickly pointed out that he's a doll. So that's not really where the uncanny terror of Julio lies. But as you said, it's in the male gaze only. And this is really a story of jealousy. And it's part of, I think, why, and we hear this a lot with the discussion of artificial intelligence today, but robots, we want them around, as long as they're making our life easier. But the minute we think they might step in and replace us, that's when we want to shut the whole thing down. And that's kind of what's happening between the narrator and Julio here, because he really realizes this moment of horror when he sees Julio taking what he sees as his rightful place. That's his place in Rebecca's bed. That's his place as Rebecca's love interest. And Julio is occupying that space. And that's not okay. That's so horrifying that it drives the poor man mad. And I think we haven't really talked about that aspect of why, robots are so terrifying to us, is because we think, oh, wait a minute, like if you're just here to make me coffee in the morning, I'm fine with it. If you're going to vacuum my floors and clean my toilets. But the minute that you might actually, fulfill a role that I want to do, then I don't need you around anymore.
Oh, yeah. And not to get too far ahead, because I know we're going to talk about, mid-20th century robots next time. But folks like Asimov and Bradbury are totally going to take that idea on. Like, how far will robots go? And are they just going to do things for us? Or are they going to be us in really creepy ways?
Okay. So right around the same time, DeMaillet was writing The Doll, which, again, I think people have placed around 1928 when she was actually writing it. There was a German expressionist film, Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang, who I knew better as the director of M, which was a film noir before film noir was really a big thing. But this is, from what I read, pretty much our first really big epic science fiction film. I know there had been science fiction films that had been made up to this point, but I read somewhere that something like $5 million was put into this film, which is just a crazy number for 1927. I have not seen the film. I've just read reviews of it and read people analyzing it. But Mel, you've seen the film, right?
I have. And listeners, if you want to check it out, it is on Netflix streaming. And I don't necessarily want to use the word version, because there's not there's not changes. But after Metropolis was first released, it was edited down a lot. And people felt like it lost some of its more positive points. And so at some point, I can't remember when it was, people, found some of the parts that were cut out and added back in. But of course you have, World War II. And anyway, the most of the original version of the way Lang would have wanted it was found, I believe, in Argentina in the mid 2000s. And just like a few years ago, it was all put back together again. And so if you watch the part that's on Netflix, it's, I believe, the fullest version that you can watch. There are parts where some is lost and they just leave the screen blank, like black, so you can see that it's gone. And then sometimes they'll put a summary of what you missed, like in parentheses, so you can kind of see what was going on. But I recommend checking it out. I mean, it's so interesting looking at it's a silent film from the 1920s, but some of the sets are just amazing. You can tell that they put, 5 million German, I can't remember what the currency would have been in Germany at that time in it. Of course, it didn't make that back, but it was actually based on a book that was written by Fritz Lang's wife at the time. I cannot remember her name. It was Thea von Harbo, which when World War II began, when Hitler came to power, they were not married anymore. And that was, of course, when he came to America and made more noir films. But Metropolis is basically your urban dystopia. It's the future. People with money live above ground. There's this one guy, Fredersen, who basically runs everything. The workers, the labor are below ground, and they live these dark lives, basically doing all the work. They're almost like slaves to the machine. And so on the top side, all the folks with money are playing around. They have cars, flying vehicles, and they're going to theaters and dancing. And it talks about the 7 deadly sins often because they're doing everything that you can think of with those. And then you have this woman called Maria who's trying to organize the workers. And she doesn't want a violent uprising. She wants to find what she calls the mediator between the two. And so she brings the kids up to the top side and then gets sent back down, tries to form connections between them. And so the son of the guy in charge of everything ends up wandering into the underside world where the machine is in order to find Maria, because he falls in love with her, of course. And while he's there, he sees how horrible everything is. He sees people dying of overwork. There's a scene where the workers aren't working fast enough, and the heart machine, as they call it, that keeps everything running, part of it starts to explode, and the workers are dying. And he has this vision of the machine as the demon Moloch, who in the Bible would
Which I love. I loved reading that detail.
would eat babies and people or whatever. The machine does the same thing. Instead of sacrifice, like in the Bible, it's just like it just uses up these people. And so during the course of the movie, Fredersen's son decides that he maybe wants to be the mediator because he identifies with the workers so much. He actually starts working down there on the sly. Meanwhile, you have this weird, like, Frankenstein type thing happening with this mad scientist, the inventor Rotwang, who has made a robot, which he calls the Machine Man. And he and the Fredersen, the guy who's in charge of everything, fought over the same woman a long time ago, and she died giving birth to Fredersen's son. And so the evil scientist, or I guess he's not evil, the mad scientist guy, the inventor, who's been driven mad from grief, wants to turn the robot into her. And then he decides, the capitalist tells him, use the robot to look like Maria and get the workers to revolt so I can use violence against them. And he builds this thing into the robot to make the robot turn against Fredersen. And so the kind of the climax of the movie is that the now evil Maria, it's like a doppelganger, because all he has to do is hook Maria up to the robot, and the robot looks exactly like her and sounds like her. Only she's evil, so she's constantly hunched over and like looking around, almost like a weird predatory alien. So she's evil, especially when she's next to the good one. But yeah, it's got all this gothic stuff like mazes and labyrinths and catacombs, and Rotwang is chasing the woman to take her face basically and put it on the machine. And at the end, you have this huge conflagration where the robot is basically forcing the workers to destroy the machine and destroy everything and come up to the top side to take out the people with wealth. And because basically the gist of the movie is that we should take care of our workers and join the capitalist top side with the worker underside, you do have a mediator at the end. There is kind of a silver lining to it. But So, people would talk about how it had this communist message. And of course, it's playing off of what was going on in Germany at the time as well, with the posters there in the movie and the way it kind of represents the futuristic society. I recommend checking it out. I mean, it's the first feature-length sci-fi film, and there's so much going on in it that you can tell that they were pulling from previous iterations of sci-fi and even the Gothic. But the Machine Man is so creepy because, I mean, you just look up a picture of the Machine Man online, and it's remarkably well done and futuristic looking. And the idea that it can, again, like the Uncanny, take on anybody's likeness and make people who know that person believe that it is that person is that fear of the double, aspect of androids and robots that we've been talking about.
I mean, Mel, listening to you describe this movie, I already knew I wanted to see it. As soon as I heard that the machine was Moloch, I was sold because that's just such a wonderful imagery there. But you kind of have everything here because you've got a futuristic dystopia, you've got Moloch, you've got a corrupt government that is actively trying to kill their people, looking for a reason to do it and be justified in doing it, which is always a horrifying idea. But I really want to see it. And as you were talking, I had to take the opportunity to look up the Machine Man. And you weren't lying. This thing it's mesmerizing, actually, looking at it. It's like, I don't know, sexy C-3PO.
That's a good way to describe it.
A good way, maybe.
It's disturbing, but it's close.
Hopefully that makes y'all want to see the movie. I don't know, but I think we should just leave with that image right there is sexy C-3PO, the Machine Man. Yeah, that's how I'm going to leave y'all with this episode. And as we talked about earlier on in the episode, our next episode is going to be a continuation of this series, and we're going to be actually looking at Isaac Asimov's work and some of the writers who are writing at the same time. So kind of the golden age of robots, really, if you think about it. And thanks for listening, and I hope you will join us next time.